Hey, everybody, welcome into Strictly Speaking on True Blue. It is good to have you here as always. I like to bring you fascinating guests about some of the most intriguing and interesting topics that we have in our world, and particularly here in this country and in our culture. And one of those, I am very sad to say, is the ongoing epidemic of mass shootings. Now, I'm saying mass shootings and not just school shootings because we are talking about something that just seems to be pervasive in almost every walk of life, or at least in every avenue where people gather, in nightclubs, in malls, in restaurants, in corporate offices, in small businesses, used to be just in post offices. Remember the old phrase going postal? And of course, in schools as well. So joining us today is Jaclyn Schildkraudt. She is the executive director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Prior to this, she served as an associate professor of criminal justice at the State University of New York. Her research focuses on school and mass shootings in the United States in regard to crime statistics, media representation, security and prevention, legislative responses, and other important considerations that impact individuals and communities struck by these tragedies. She's been published in numerous academic journals. Her research has been cited by local, national, and even international media. She's committed to helping change the narrative about mass shootings, mass shooting events, and encouraging a proactive approach to safety and prevention. Her most recent book is titled Guns in American Society, an encyclopedia of history, politics, culture, and the law. She is the author of 6 books in total. You'll see them flashing across your screen right now. Her most recently published article is entitled Mass Shootings in the United States, Prevalence, Policy, and a Way Forward. In other words, she is exactly what we were looking for when we said, let's get an expert to discuss the epidemic of mass shootings. So, Jackie Schildkraudt, thank you so much for joining us here on Strictly Speaking. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you. Um, Before we get into the details of your research and your work, why? Why have you devoted such a huge part of your life to doing this research and reporting on it, writing about it, and obviously talking to folks like me about it? This is a fascinating career arc for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. My mom growing up always talked to me about, defining moments that we see in our lifetimes. And for her, it was, she knows where she was the day JFK was assassinated. And for me, the defining moment was really Columbine. I grew up and graduated high school the year before Columbine. Please, listeners, don't do the math on that one. And, I remember where I was when Columbine happened. I remember where I was when Virginia Tech happened, and it was something I could really kind of almost resonate with because, again, I had just graduated the year before, but it could have been my school. I was in college when Virginia Tech happened. It could have been my school. And so, I just sort of, after Virginia Tech said, I need to do something, I want to help. And here we are 16 years later.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Virginia Tech too, because when we think about most of the mass shootings we see in schools, they're happening at high schools, or they're happening, as in Columbine's case, they're happening in elementary schools like Uvalde. And we'll talk a little bit about each of those, but it also happens on the campuses of higher education as well, including Virginia Tech, which was just devastating. Before we get into all of that, let's talk about Columbine and the fact that back then, there was no lockdown procedure in place for mass shooting back when Columbine happened, 1999, right? I think it was.
Yeah.
Um, you have spent a significant portion of all the research that you're doing talking about lockdowns. In fact, I saw an interview you did with some people who say lockdown training for kids does more harm than good. It traumatizes them. The likelihood that they're going to face a mass shooting is probably, so slim to none that why put them through all of that trauma? You obviously believe that it does more good than harm. Tell us why.
I think like anything else that we do in our lives, it's really not about what you do, but how you do it. There's, information out there from groups like the National Association of School Psychologists, National Association of School Resource Officers, and Safe and Sound Schools that lay out these really trauma-informed principles to ensure that we're mitigating harm as much as possible. The reality is mass shootings in our country, as prevalent as they are in terms of how much we hear about them in the news and the statistics that are sort of thrown around, are still very rare events. But one of the things that is so important, and I know this unfortunately from personal experience, is that it's so much better to have the tools and not need them than to need them and not have them. I grew up in a community where we experienced a a very high profile mass shooting back in 2018, and there was very little in the way of emergency preparedness. And so when that happened, a lot of people may not have had the tools that they need. I don't want a Monday night quarterback here and, point fingers, but the absence of training, can have catastrophic impacts. The other thing we have to think about, again, as I started, it's how we do what we do. We've been doing fire drills in schools since the 1950s, and there's not anybody dying in fires in schools. But at the same time, we're not lighting schools on fire to go and practice a fire drill. So it begs the question of why we're seeing buildings, simulate active shooter events to effectively build skill mastery about how to, execute a procedure during times of stress.
So, are there any statistics from any of the people pushing back on the idea of lockdowns, lockdown training, statistics on kids suffering from trauma or post-traumatic stress or anything as a result of these things? I do get it. And one of the debaters or whatever you want to call it that you appeared on an interview with, was saying that, the teacher was even freaking out and telling the kids, I'm calling my own mom. We're not supposed to have cell phones in school. And a kid said, can I call my mom? And she said, I kind of want to call my own. I'm scared, even though it was only a dramatization, even though it was only a simulation. So are there actually statistics showing that kids are being harmed by this, or are they just kind of rolling with it the way they do with tornado drills, fire drills, and back in the 80s, in the middle of the Cold War, or in the early 80s, the nuclear blast drills that we did?
Yeah, the duck and covers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the challenge is the following. Number one of the things that we're seeing, and I spent 5 years in a school district, running lockdown drills, observing the practice, and what I found when I came away from those 5 years, which I found absolutely fascinating, was the fact that I had more issues with adults than kids. And the challenge is, when we talk about kids today, they're all part of this, quote unquote Columbine generation. They don't know a world without lockdown drills or active shooter drills. Whereas many of the adults in the room have to get their mindset from pre-1999 to 2023. And that's a pretty big shift when it's not something that you're used to. Going back to those trauma-informed principles of drills, one of the number one ways to keep kids calm is for the adults to model calm behavior. If you're kind of down here, they stay down here. It's when the teachers get elevated that the students sort of follow with them. The challenge is when we look at all of this, lockdown drills and active shooter drills, which are not the same thing. Lockdown drills can be used for any, imminent danger inside of a building. Active shooter drills are just active shooters. But so there's some technical differences between the two of them. But the reality is that collectively between the two, there's such a small body of research that is available out there. There's one study that gets pointed to a lot that looks at sentiments about harm coming from drills on social media. But the challenge is it's pulling a lot of information from tweets, which we know kids today are not typically on Twitter. They're on Snapchat, Instagram, and TikTok. So, in terms of a wide scale understanding of the negative and even positive consequences of drills, we simply just don't have that data available.
One more question on drills for the moment. We may come back to it. Do you think corporations, businesses, do they need to do these things as well? Do they need to do lockdown training the way you are in schools?
I don't necessarily know if it needs to be to the level of schools, though I wouldn't say don't do it. I think one thing I really want to differentiate for listeners is that there are quantitative and qualitative differences between a drill and training. Training is where you learn how to do something, right? We all go through training for our jobs. Whether it's I had to learn statistics, other people learn how to, do customer service. But when you go through a drill, it's practicing those skills. So even in the school space, we see a lot of confusion where people are saying we're doing training, but what they're really doing is drills. So they're practicing something without teaching anybody what to do. The training is really the cornerstone of emergency preparedness. So, I certainly advocate for businesses in any capacity, whether it's public facing businesses, whether it's places of worship. You just never know. It's really important to have that training because every environment is different. And so if you know what to do in your space, that can be really helpful. Sort of as an anecdote, my brother was actually at a restaurant in a mall one day and a shooting happened, or they thought a shooting was happening in the mall. And the employees of that restaurant chain had received training. And so they very calmly, closed up all the doors, got everybody to the back of the restaurant because they knew what to do because they had been trained. Whereas at other points in the mall, it could have potentially been chaos without that training.
Interesting. Do you, on the school side, do you get pushback from any parents? Do they give you any grief? Why are you putting my kids through training? As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about guns. We have to, obviously, it's a big, big part of this conversation. But so many that I hear, or at least a lot of parents that I hear, I do a radio show, so I talk to a lot of different people. Why do you have to train our kids on how to not die? How about we just get rid of the guns? That seems to be, kind of the mantra. They don't like their kids going through that traumatic type of stress as well.
You know, I have not personally experienced any pushback from parents. We've been very fortunate. I think part of it is also making sure that parents are educated on the process. So
Mhm.
when we began our research 5 years ago, we held open sessions for parents to come learn about what the protocol was, what we were going to be training their kids on. Information went home to them every single year that we were there, just refreshing them on that information, even, regardless of whether or not they had chosen to take advantage of those open sessions. So I think, the education component is really important. I think one place where we were also very successful in sort of keeping that temperature down is we didn't come in and say, look, we're just here to train you for active shooters. We looked at it from a holistic perspective of all hazards emergency preparedness. So this was one piece of making sure that they were prepared to respond to any emergency in the school. So I think the way you talk about these things is also very important. I think creating opportunities for questions to be asked. So much of this conversation really does take place in the media, and that in itself can, one thing I've learned about doing this work for as long as I have is, especially with social media, everybody's an expert. And so the challenge is, the actual research or evidence or best practices can get very much lost in that conversation. And so I think, again, creating that opportunity for education is so critical.
So, Jackie, one of your books is Guns in American Society, an encyclopedia of history, politics, culture, and the law. So, let's do the gun part of this now. And I guess we're going to do this kind of combined with the psychological part of this because I think ultimately that's where the debate comes down. People who are terrified of guns believe they're only built, they're only designed to kill, not to protect or to save. And they say if we get rid of the guns, we won't have these problems on all these mass shootings. We don't have them anywhere around the world. People are very much aware of the ability for firearms to be protective. As a matter of fact, there are more people who die from people using firearms responsibly and protecting themselves and others than people who are killed by them with nefarious intentions. And they say it's not the guns, it's the people. It's the people, it's the psychological aspect of things, it's people with mental health disorders, depression, anxiety. We got a
Sorry.
dog in the background. That's
Yeah,
okay.
sorry.
But depression, anxiety, and all of these kinds of things, and these are the people that are dangerous. And so, which begs the question: well, then, how do we disarm those individuals? So let's talk. Let's first talk about your stand on Americans' Second Amendment rights and how we do differ from the rest of the world in terms of our ability to access guns and the number of mass shooting events that we have.
That is a very big question. I think, one thing I just kind of want to give the caveat that, my stance is what the evidence says. I'm not here to push my political agenda as a researcher. My job is to put evidence out to make sure that people can make informed decisions, whatever those decisions may be. I think, putting the genie back in the bottle in respect to the number of firearms in circulation in our nation is not going to happen. But I think one thing that gets lost in this conversation is that the point
Are you
of
before you continue? Are you pro Second Amendment or anti, based on what the evidence suggests? As you said, it's not
I'm
your
not going to
political
answer that
agenda.
question.
You
Yeah,
can't do that.
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
I think we have to be mindful of what the Second Amendment is enshrined to do, and that is to protect the rights of law-abiding gun owners. We have processes in place to make sure that firearms are in the hands of people who meet the criteria to have firearms.
Mhm.
There are prohibited characteristics. So, for instance, we know that if you have been dishonorably discharged from the military, if you have been adjudicated by a court as mentally defective, if you are a domestic violence abuser, those are situations in which the law says you cannot own a firearm. But, I think one thing that we have to be really careful about in this conversation is the fact that individuals with mental illness are not prohibited from having firearms. It is only if they have been adjudicated mentally defective, meaning they can't take care of themselves at that
Mhm.
point,
Right.
where the court says you cannot have a firearm. In the same vein, what we also have to be mindful of is the fact that individuals who suffer from mental illness are more likely to be the victims of harm than the perpetrators of harm. So, from the research perspective, one thing that we always talk about is the importance of correlation not equaling causation, right? We saw after Sandy Hook there was a big push to criminalize individuals with Asperger's because
Mhm.
the perpetrator had Asperger's. But if you look at the research on Asperger's, these are individuals who effectively have highly functioning autism, and they are very rarely violent. If they are violent, it's almost never outside of their home, and they typically don't ever pick up a weapon. So you had one person who had these characteristics, and then the entire group got scapegoated for it. For a broader comparison, it's kind of like when people say, well, mass shooters play video games, violent video games, and you look at how many people play Call of Duty. Does that mean that everybody who plays Call of Duty is going to go out and be a mass shooter? No.
Well, but that's not what people say. I don't think anybody thinks anybody who plays that is going to go out and be a mass shooter. But do those things influence those who may have a little bit of a different mental makeup than others? Can those things inspire them to go out and carry things like that out? Or maybe if inspire is the wrong word, can they sometimes blur the line between their video game fantasies and reality? Do some of those people get impacted by that?
I think, and I will say there's great research out there by my colleague Chris Ferguson that looks at the effects of video games on violence and aggression. And that whole body of research has very mixed results. Some say, some studies say yes, some studies say no, some studies say there's no difference. A lot of it has to do with the group you're looking at, the, mechanism of, or the sort of intervention, if you will, of what that violent media is. But I think that any person can really blur the lines between fantasy and reality. The challenge with these individuals is, in about 50% of cases, the perpetrator doesn't survive the attack for whatever reason. Either they take their own life, they're killed by law enforcement. And so the people who can tell you really why they're doing what they're doing aren't here to do that. The other half, go through trials, and then you start running into things like, are they going to plead guilty before they ever go to trial, which is what happened with the perpetrator in our community. I grew up in the Parkland area, and our perpetrator, after 5 years, just pled guilty, and there was never a trial in the sense of finding of guilt, which is where you'd
Right.
have the evidence and all sorts of things. So a lot of times we're left to speculate why these individuals are doing what they're doing. But there is sort of a model, if you will, that outlines the behaviors of these individuals, which are remarkably similar. It's called the Path to Intended Violence model. It was originated back in the 1980s with the US Secret Service. For any listeners and you who might be familiar, back in the 1980s, we had a lot of high profile assassinations and assassination attempts. So somebody tried to kill President Reagan, somebody did assassinate John Lennon. And so in kind of examining all of these cases of, attackers and plotters, the Secret Service found that there's a lot of very similar behaviors in terms of their trajectory from, sort of having this grievance or this fixation to carrying out their attack. And then in the late 90s, when Columbine happened, as well as a number of other school shootings that kind of all happened in this cluster, then basically they applied that same model. So even though we have a lot of difference in terms of what perpetrators look like and, what their grievance might be, or, their whatever they're angry and upset about, they're literally all doing almost the exact same thing.
So you talk about, sometimes we don't find out why they do what they do because they either die or they plead guilty if they do go to trial. Sometimes we do through the online manifestos. What are your thoughts about what happened in Tennessee? what was it, Audrey Hale, I think it was, right? Audrey Hale. That manifesto was made known that it existed months and months and months ago. It finally got leaked by somebody in the police department just a couple of days ago, or for a couple of days before our taping here. Should the public see those things? Should we learn why these people are driven to do these things, whether it is mental illness, whether it is a personal grudge, a vendetta, or whatever the case might be? Is it important for the public to know?
That's such a slippery slope kind of question because, I think our society believes it has a right to know. Certainly we've become very much consumers of the media that, and the media, and this is, it's sort of a double-edged sword, right? We rely on it for so much and there's so many benefits to the media, but then also there's a lot of drawbacks. The average citizen feels as though they have a right to know, right? We have a right to this information. Our society has created that right for us. But the majority of citizens in society aren't going to necessarily have the breadth of skills to really delve into the complexities of knowing, in the sense that, even I'm not a psychologist by background. So, as much research as I can do, I can't explain psychological profiles of everybody. I'd have to go to a psychologist to explain that. So I think that the challenge is we have to balance public good and what the public stands to gain from having that information with the potential harms that it does. One of the things that we see over and over again is when manifestos come out, they receive a lot of attention, as do the perpetrators, before we even know whether or not there is a manifesto. And the
Well,
challenge with that,
immediately people start digging into their social media background, what posts said they made, what tweets said they made, and so forth, to see if there's an insight as to why they did what they did. They're looking for political motivations, or again, whatever cultural issues or personal, like I said, experiences, vendettas, divorces, breakups, those kinds of things happen. So we're looking for a manifesto all the time. To your earlier point, though, about what value there might be in the public having it, it's not just we're the public, we have a right to know, but if there is any kind of pattern that can be recognized among the sadly growing number of mass shooters, to kind of have an idea of what to look for in other people, in other troubled people, in other people in certain circumstances that might say, that looks like something else that I knew or something that I read about or a manifesto that went public and so forth. Is there any value in that?
absolutely. The reality is, as I mentioned a little bit ago, we know that there are steps of behaviors that are very overt. There's been research done by the U.S. Secret Service, with their National Threat Assessment Center, that shows that that very same model that they developed to look at, assassination attackers and plotters applies very similarly to mass shooters. I think, again, when we're thinking about looking for these motives, and listen, I was online when the news broke about the Lewiston shooting, and before they ever even gave the guy's name out, there was pictures of screenshots of his social media. I don't know where they came from. I saw them. I know other people saw them as well. We know that there are a specific set of behaviors and steps that go from having this grievance or this grudge or whatever is going to motivate these individuals to go out and commit this attack. Once they make a decision where they stop fantasizing about it and start putting action behind that, they're going to engage in things like collecting weapons. They're going to, kind of stockpile ammunition. One of the most overt things that they will do is literally tell anybody who will listen what they're about to do. It's a process called leakage. So if we understand, I think something that's more of value versus their manifesto is to train people based on the contents of those manifestos, and the other leakage that's made through social media. What does leakage look like? What are the types of threats? How are they structured? How are people conveying or communicating these intentions? So that way people know and say, look, I've got this information. This is a person of concern. I don't personally have the tools. And I mean, I say this about myself. I don't, as much as I'd love to think that I could go solve all crime, I don't have the resources to do that. I don't have powers of arrest, search, and seizure. I don't have the ability to go file in a court for those things, right? That's law enforcement's job. My job as a civilian is to, if I have that information, get it to law enforcement so that they can do their job and ultimately intervene and prevent the shooting. So we civilians can't.
Should anybody have that? Should anybody have that ability? What you just said, you don't have the ability to do, arrest or search and seizure or anything else. Should law enforcement? We're talking about red flag laws here, I think, essentially, which is a huge topic of conversation in trying to stop potential mass shooters. Who knew that this person was having psychological issues or mental issues or emotional issues or whatever? And can and should they be able to report those to authorities and have authorities take away their guns, stripping them of their Second Amendment rights before they've ever done anything wrong? Because somebody said that they might someday, they might do something wrong.
So, again, it's a very slippery slope, because the reality is that, number one, you're not being stripped of your Second Amendment rights. What a red flag law does is it removes the instrumentality of killing, whether it's another person or self-harm, for an individual that poses a heightened risk against of that happening. But I can't just go make up a story and tell the court, because I'm mad at somebody, that this might happen. There's evidentiary requirements that you have to meet in order for that petition to be granted. So as much as it's designed to protect people by removing those instruments of lethality, it's also still designed to protect the rights so that people can't be abused by that system.
Yeah, and I think in many ways that is true, except that the way that it's being proposed by some legislatively and activists is to do all of that after the guns have been taken away. In other words, no due process. We're going to take the guns. Now we'll go through that evidentiary procedure you just described. What evidence that you have that this person might be unstable, that they might be planning to harm themselves or others. In other words, I've got to go to court. If somebody thinks this of me, I've got to go to court and prove myself to be of sound mind and body and stability and so on and so forth to get my guns back because they've already taken them away. That's kind of what many of the red flag law proposals are. And I'm wondering if that isn't a step too far, because it reminds me a lot of, you probably remember the movie Minority Report, right? Did you see that with Tom Cruise?
Is that one?
Yeah, it was a futuristic type of society in which they used precognitive people who could actually kind of see the future. They arrested people on crimes that the precogs said they are going to commit in the future. Now, this isn't arresting people, but it's similar in that somebody who is close to a person is saying, I think they might be a danger to themselves or others. I know they have firearms. Go and take them away, and then make that person prove, no, I'm not. I'm fine. Give them back, which, of course, is a very, very slippery slope in and of itself.
Right, but you can't just propose it in as, and I don't mean any disrespect, it's not as simplistic as the way that that statement was made, right? You still have to articulate. You can't say this person is a person of concern, because you have to say why they are a person of concern. There are due process elements built into those red flag laws, so that you have to, if you really believe that that is an individual of concern, you still have to provide support for that ERPO to be granted. And then, yes, there is an additional process where individuals who've had their firearms removed will come into court and have the opportunity to be able to refute that and potentially get that order lessened, overturned, or whatever the outcome is. But again, there are elements of due process that are already inherently built into them to make sure it can't be weaponized. And part of that means you have to be able to articulate why that individual is a person of concern. Bob is having a bad day is not significant enough to remove Bob's firearms, but Bob is having a bad day and is making threats that he's going to take his own life, and I know he has firearms, which is a means to do that, is a very different set of, sort of outlining.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I know your position on this. You said it earlier on. You're not trying to, through your research, through your work, through your presentations, trying to advance any kind of political agenda, and that's good. However, a lot of people are. And what I'm talking about, or what I'm concerned about, is Bob isn't just having a bad day, but Bob just got divorced. Then we found out his dog died. Then he got fired from his job. And he really, really is angry at the government for all of these things. And he's made statements before about how I wish somebody would blow that guy away. And I happen to know he's got a firearm in his house. Somebody with a political agenda could say, I'm going to make sure that guy loses his gun. Somebody might, particularly if they're defensive of the government actor, that this person said they might, wish somebody would blow them away. In a case like that, Bob now is going to have to get a lawyer and go spend an awful lot of time in court trying to say, I am having a bad time right now, but in no way, shape, or form have I ever threatened anybody. And he's going to have to prove himself. He's going to have to prove himself after the fact that he's innocent of anything somebody thought he might do. Is that too far in order to try to stop these mass shootings that you study for a living?
I mean, I think that the challenge is we could debate this all day, right? We could come up with 8,000 iterations of what if. What if Bob said A instead of B, and what if Bob had this type of gun instead of this type of gun. I think we have to put some faith as much as we can into our legal system and the laws as they are constructed to protect the rights of citizens, to ensure those due process guarantees. That part of going back to what I said about law enforcement is, if somebody makes a threat to me, I don't have the capabilities to determine if that individual has the means to carry it out, right? It's not even about motive at that point. It's a lot about means. And again, the court, before they just grant, courts get petitions for ERPOs all the time, and they are just not like rubber stamping them willy nilly. The courts will hold a hearing where the petitioner has to provide, with that due process in mind, evidence that shows that this is a person. We all spout off. I think, I'm guilty of it too. I've said things where I'm just like, oh my gosh, this person is just making me peeved, and I would like to punch them in the face or something. I'm not going to go out and do it, right?
Right.
So there's a lot going on there. It's not something, unfortunately, that is incredibly black and white, where there's going to be a right or a wrong answer. And so I think we have to put our trust in the court and in our legal system to say, these are the parameters. There is a gray area. We have to weigh all of the evidence. Not only is this individual a potential harm to themselves or others, but also have they met certain thresholds to support the removal of their guns. And again, one thing I really, really want to stress here is ERPOs are not stripping people of their Second Amendment rights. You can kind of think of it, in very sort of, and this is really watering it down, almost like taking a timeout from your firearm. If you're at a heightened point where you might be more likely to pick that up and use it for harm, again, not only against other people, but against yourself, the idea is to just separate you from that instrumentality until the situation de-escalates. So it's not a permanent, you're never going to see your firearm again. It's not, you're never allowed to have a firearm. It's, right now, we need to separate you from the means to harm yourself and or others until we can de-escalate the situation to where that is not going to put you at a heightened risk for harming yourself and others.
Let's Jackie, let's talk about some of the more high profile cases in the mass shootings you've studied. The most recent one is, I think it's Robert Card was the shooter in Maine, who ended up being found, I don't know, a few days after his terrible attack. And it was discovered that he had spent 2 weeks in a mental institution of some sort or another. And it's funny because we don't have, quote, mental institutions like we used to anymore for involuntary commitment. I don't know what his circumstances were, but he was earlier in the summer in a 2-week facility. Whether he put himself there or was put there, I don't know. Is that grounds when somebody is in that, an inpatient type of mental facility like that? Is that grounds for saying this guy probably should never be allowed to own a firearm?
So there's some challenges there. And, one thing that we have to think about is laws are only as good as A, the way they're written, and B, the people behind them. And the challenge is, in the state that he lived in, Maine did not have a red flag law. They have what's called a yellow flag law, which means that law enforcement can petition for the removal of a firearm, again, for somebody who presents an imminent danger to themselves or others. But the yellow flag part means that there has to be an added layer there, which in which a medical doctor effectively signs off on it, right? This, yes, in my medical opinion, this person needs to have their firearms removed. From the
Psychiatric? It's got to be a psychiatric, not an MD, right? It's got to be a psychiatric physician.
I'm not 100% sure the way
Okay.
the law is written. The challenge is, if you're looking at it from a legal perspective with federal law in terms of who qualifies as a prohibited person, meaning that they cannot, forgetting having their firearms removed, they can't have them in the first place. That is an individual who has been adjudicated as mentally defective. So what would have happened is he would have had to undergo essentially a civil commitment hearing with a judge who then said, you need to be committed. At that point, he would have become a prohibited person. The challenge is this individual obviously posed a lot of red flags, right?
Right.
In addition to that he was also, I mean, again, before his name was even released, we were being told he was threatening to shoot up an armed guard, center. So,
Mhm.
that's where those laws are designed, the red flag and yellow flag laws. When somebody's making very overt threats and they have the means to carry them out, separate those two things from each other. But in terms of him being disqualified under the law, that's a very, very specific issue. One of the reasons I think that it becomes very contentious when we think about mass shooters is that we've seen multiple situations before we ever got to Maine where we knew individuals should have been prohibited under the law and they weren't because the system failed. So if you look back at Virginia Tech, this is an individual who was making very overt threats, who was demonstrating, warning signs of this type of behavior, threatened suicide, which actually ended him in an involuntary commitment. He was under a psychiatric hold where it was involuntary. And it's interesting. So if you're not familiar with this, the state of Virginia at their library actually unsealed 65 boxes of documents related to this case. One of my colleagues and I actually a couple months ago started going through them. Takes a really long time to get through 65 boxes, as you might imagine. But one of the papers that we did come across, which is the product of that commitment hearing, was he went before a judge and was declared an imminent danger to himself. The problem was at that moment, the judge then, due to a shortage of resources in mental health, which we know is a problem not only in Virginia, but across this nation, the judge checked a box that said outpatient treatment, which then puts the onus on that individual, meaning the perpetrator, to follow up, to seek treatment, to go through all of those motions. But that entire exchange never got reported to the background check system. So when he went to go purchase a firearm, which now he's been adjudicated as mentally defective in some capacity, because that was not reported, he literally walked into a federally licensed firearm dealer, purchased a gun, waited the 30-day mandated waiting period that was implemented by the state, and bought the second gun that was used in the shooting. That's a failure of the system. He technically should have been disqualified, but the record wasn't there. Fast forward 10 years from that to the Sutherland Springs shooting, and that perpetrator had domestic violence convictions, which eliminates your ability to own a firearm, and also dishonorable discharge and imprisonment within the military. But in the after action report that came out, the United States Air Force did not report any of that into the background check system. So he also was not stopped when he went to an FFL and purchased 4 firearms. So, we have these systems, but we don't always use them as a nation to their, fullest efficacy.
Yeah, and those are some really horrific examples of the system failing. Have you found though, in your research and studying of all these mass shooting events and these mass shooters, you study them as well, I assume, right? In terms of, okay, if somebody is bound and determined to do something like that, there's no system that's going to stop them. And I think too, for example, one of the most horrific that we have anybody can, not that any one life is more precious than another, but when kids are involved, you know the story. So in Newtown, Connecticut, in that Sandy Hook shooting, Adam Lanza was clearly mentally unstable. He certainly could not have bought a firearm had he wanted to, so he stole them from his mother, killed his mother, and then went and of course shot up that school building. Do you find that is common, that the drive for a particular mass shooter or a potential mass shooter, law's not going to stop them? If they can't get it legally, they'll find another way to get it. They'll buy it on the black market. They'll steal it. They'll do what they have to do to be able to carry out whatever their motivation is.
Well, just for clarification, he didn't steal them from his mother. He had free access to them in the home. He knew the combination to the safe. He had access to them. His mother took him out shooting. I mean, so guns were part of their relationship. Certainly anybody who's willing to commit harm or commit, I mean, it doesn't even have to be harm. Like if somebody wants to go
Yep.
out and commit a crime, they're going to go and find a way to do it. What our job, and I say our collectively as society, our legal system, our law enforcement
Mhm.
system, our judicial system, is designed to do is not make that process easier. And so, certainly we know, of course, that to your point, yes, if somebody wants to purchase a firearm and they are a prohibited person, then they don't even have to go to the black market. They can go to a private seller because background checks are only are only required of FFLs. But that begs the question why we aren't requiring every firearm purchase to go through a background check when of all of the policies that are presented after mass shootings or anything related to gun control, or gun regulations. I won't say gun control, but gun regulations, that it doesn't matter whether you're an NRA member, non-NRA member, gun owner, non-gun owner, man, woman, what your race and ethnicity is. Universal background checks are the number one supported policy, but yet we don't have them in this country. 90% of the populace is like, yep, listen, if I want to own a gun, I'll go through the background check because that's what you're telling me I have to do. And but yet we don't have them on private sellers. So there's ways that we can put up more obstacles. It's interesting that you use Sandy Hook as an example, because one of the things that they did when they built the new school was they took a very layered approach, right? It still looks like a school and it's very warm and it's very inviting, but there are these sort of subtle environmental barriers, if you will, in terms of how that building is designed so that you can't just walk right up to the door and do what he did, right? There's layer upon layer upon layer. And there's ways within our society that we can also put those layers in front of a person to potentially prevent or at least slow down what is about to happen.
Should there be armed security in every school building?
You know, that again is such a difficult question to answer, because when we're talking about mass shootings, especially mass shootings in school, they're incredibly rare. And you have to balance whether or what message putting armed guards in schools sends to kids with what good they seek to do. We know that there are, I've been very fortunate to be on task forces with some of them, that there are some great law enforcement folks who work in schools who build great relationships with kids, so that if, let's say, students in schools are always the ones that hear about things first, right? Adults are usually the last ones to hear about it. So if they hear about somebody who is going to potentially cause harm to themselves or others, if they've got a good relationship with that law enforcement officer, with another adult in the building, they might be more likely to come forward. So there are really good relationships that can be built with law enforcement in schools. On the same token, there's a lot of law enforcement who frankly just should not be in schools because they don't have the right skill set or mentality or capabilities to deal with children every day. And so, it's again a balance. We also have to think about where they're being placed. There was an interesting study, and it's about metal detectors, not security officers, but I think it's kind of tangentially related. Looking at the 5 boroughs of New York State or New York City, right? And when you look at like where metal detectors are placed, they're predominantly concentrated in Black and brown schools, but yet not in Staten Island, where the population is predominantly white. So we have to make sure that whatever we're doing security wise is being balanced with not criminalizing children.
Yeah, and I think about law enforcement being on the scene, and two of the worst that we have ever seen, Parkland and Uvalde, the police were there, or at least, we all remember the story, or to some extent, we know the story of the quote unquote coward of Broward, the deputy that was on the scene, who waited outside while the shooter, Cruz, I think it was, and we're going to get to the names here in a moment, whether or not that matters. And then in Uvalde, the response was relatively quick, I guess, but they got there and then they just didn't do anything. They wouldn't go in. They kept hearing shots, they kept hearing cries, and they wouldn't break through the door or open the door or whatever and confront it. So, at the end of the day, law enforcement can help, but there has to be probably better training for them on how to deal with an active shooter situation than even the lockdown training that goes on in the schools.
Right. Lockdown training that goes on in the schools has a specific purpose. We know that the number one thing that saves people's lives in an active shooter event in a school, but also outside of school, is that door lock. Because what it does is it's building time and space between you and the threat. Most mass shootings, obviously Uvalde is a very, very rare exception, are
Yeah.
over in 5 minutes or less. And so these are not individuals who are like, I have all this time in the world. Let me sit here and defeat this door lock so I can get, into this room for whatever reason. If we look even back at Columbine, where police response practices in 1999 are very different than they are today. Back in 1999, it was you create a perimeter as patrol officers, to keep the threat contained, and you wait for SWAT to come and neutralize it. And as a result, you had two teenagers who had 4 guns, 100 IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and full control of this school for 50 minutes. And even still, with hundreds of people locked down inside of that building, they never once tried to breach a locked door. So, these are individuals who are looking for people that they can harm relatively easily, relatively quickly. And so, the purpose of the lockdown training is to put those seconds and minutes on the clock for you as the civilian inside of that building. Law enforcement training has evolved drastically since Columbine, and continues to do so today. There's the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Center in Texas. That is, the active shooter standard. They do a lot of the training for law enforcement in the United States. And they're constantly, refining and revamping their tools as the threat or the nature of the threat changes.
So, Jackie, what about armed staff members? What about armed faculty? That's been a big topic of conversation as well. Not, of course, mandatory for anybody. Nobody wants to arm 65-year-old Mrs. Johnson, the fourth grade math teacher, and make her strap. But individuals who are not uniformed, plain clothes, generally speaking, I don't mean to be stereotyping here by sex, but males, particularly those who come to work every day in their classrooms with a jacket on, who can, of course, maybe conceal a weapon. Because when you're talking about, responses from law enforcement in rural communities where it's not 4 minutes away or 5 minutes away, it is, we're going to let that siren go by. Pause for a second
Ironic timing.
here. Yeah. Yeah, right. All right, I'm going to pick that up from there in 3, 2, 1. So in rural communities, law enforcement is, 15 minutes away, 20 minutes away, maybe even more. And if somebody really wants to do some damage, they can do it. So what about the idea of arming trained, concealed carry, permitted faculty members to be on staff? What do you think?
To this point, especially when we're looking at schools, there is no evidence to suggest that an armed teacher would either be a deterrent or a response to an active shooter. That doesn't mean it can't happen, just means that the evidence does not exist to this point. I think, there are a lot of factors that go into that. Certainly the comfort level, the amount of training, the type of weapon being used, the storage options that have to be considered by a school district who is weighing those options. Of course, there's a balance between perceptions, whether it's perceptions of the teachers and the students and the parents, which are largely not favorable of these policies, with law enforcement and school administrators, which are more mixed, in terms of whether or not that policy would pass. But we know that these are, currently that there are programs in place in 28 states and over 500 districts in the United States. So it's not, again, we don't have evidence to say it would or wouldn't work. We don't have the evidence. But I think it's, it comes down to a cost benefit analysis for the school district itself.
Yeah, of course it does. I want to ask about the role of media in you know, I've said a few of the names that Robert Card and Adelanza and Nicholas Cruz, and there may be others I could say. A lot of people won't do that. A lot of people in my line of work in radio and television, they won't say their names because they don't want to glorify, because the belief is that for some of these copycatters, they have seen fame. These people are going out in a blaze of glory. Their name is going to be famous or infamous. They don't care. This is how they're going to exit this world, and everybody's going to know who they are. Should the media downplay mass shootings for that purpose and downplay the recognition? I mentioned the manifesto before, and talking about these people after they've committed these terrible crimes and found themselves exiting this world either by their own hand or one of the law enforcement responders.
There's nothing to be gained from naming them. I am a big proponent of no notoriety. I do not say their names when I write them. In fact, we did an entire case study on Parkland, and we never once referenced his name. He was literally referenced by his initials. I think we have to think about this from a couple of perspectives. Number one, we have individuals who are going out and very openly doing this and saying that they're doing this in writings they leave behind, in these manifestos. In our case in Parkland, he made videos where he said, my name is such and such, and you'll know who I am when you see me on the news. I mean, he really wanted to be famous. And so it's kind of a twofold whammy, if you will, because when the media consistently glamorize these individuals by saying their names and posting their pictures over and over and over again, then what you're doing is you're effectively rewarding people for killing other people. You're giving them exactly what they wanted, which was to have themselves be famous. At the same time, what you're also doing is then signaling to other individuals, well, if you want attention and notoriety, all you have to do is go do this, and you're going to get splashed all over the media. There are some instances where getting their name and their picture all over the place is absolutely vital. And Lewiston is a prime example of that. You had an individual who his whereabouts were unknown for almost 48 hours. At that point, his name and picture should be everywhere. He poses a significant threat to public safety. We don't know, there is obviously talk about him committing more acts. At that point, nobody knows where in the state he is, if he's even still in the state. Absolutely. Get his name and picture everywhere, because we want to make sure that this individual is no longer an active threat. But once that happens, switch over to this no notoriety protocol, limit the use of this information. Kind of going back to what we started from, because I hear a lot of pushback on well, we have a right to know. His name is important to what all of this is. But here's the reality, and I know I don't need to tell you this as a media person, right? Your job is to tell a story that involves who, what, where, when, why, and how, correct?
I
And
would
if
agree.
you say, we'll use Parkland as an example, a 19-year-old former student went to his former high school on this day at this time and opened fire, killing 17 people and wounding 17 others. I did not tell you the who, what, when, where, and why, and how. All I did was
Except for
not
the
use
who.
his name. No,
Except for the who.
I
You
didn't.
said a 19-year-old. You said a
I said
19-year-old, but
19-year-old former student. The
right.
who is irrelevant, because that 19-year-old former student could have been anybody. The minute you attach his name to it, you've given him everything that he wants. To this day, you have countless people who can name him. We're 5.5 years out from our shooting. You know his name very well. After the shooting, there were people who were sending him money. He was receiving hundreds and thousands of dollars from fans. But yet, can you name any of his victims, or let alone all 17 of his victims? There are people who made a choice in that situation.
Have you studied that in your research, Jackie? The fandom, the grotesque nature of what you just said. People who actually support some of these killers and send them love letters. I mean, I could go on and talk about desperate women who actually will write to convicts in prisons and marry them while they're never going to actually be with them. Whatever drives somebody to do that is one thing. But as you study all elements of mass shootings, as you do in all of your research, do you look at that at all? Any of the fanboys or fangirls, if you will, that actually support these people?
I have not. There is a albeit small body of research that looks at it, as you said, to the people, not just women, but men also, who write to people in prison. We know that Charles Manson had a huge following.
Oh,
People
still
married the
does, even
Menendez
after death.
brothers. Yeah, people married the Menendez brothers while they're incarcerated. There's a lot of people support criminals. There is actually a term for that. It's called hybristophilia, and it's the sexual attraction to a murderer. And I don't understand it. I don't have it. It doesn't mean I maybe one day could. I don't know, but
But there is a term for it, and that's
there is a
news. I
term
did
for
not
it.
know that. That's so you
Yeah.
have studied it, at least in another fact. But it's just weird to me that people sent him money, and as you pointed out, maybe if his name didn't get out there, of course, it only has to get out there once in order for it to be on everybody's tongue, particularly in a given community. But how anybody could say, "Yeah, that's who that is," and I'm going to send them money, that's another story. I want to, in the time that we have left here, Jackie, I want to throw up, Ryan. Can you give me that list? We just went ahead to plain old Wikipedia, Jackie, to pull up some of the worst mass shooting cases, I'm sure all of which you have studied. And On the screen there, you can see the very first one, the most notorious simply by body count, I guess, was the 2017 Las Vegas shooting. That did you study that, Jackie? And particularly, I'm still very interested in how that individual shooter was able to carry out what he did, considering he shot from a hotel window and those windows do not open. He had to have shattered it, but it wasn't shattered. It was like it was removed somehow. There were a lot of people who still wonder to this day, 6 years on, whether or not that was indeed an only, a lone wolf type of thing, or if there was some assistance that he got in carrying that out. What's unique to you about that story?
So first of all, the windows were not removed. They were shot. They were actually weren't even shot out. They were broken out with a hammer. And if anybody goes back and looks at the video footage or the photographic evidence from that day, you can see very clearly that the windows are broken out. The challenge with Las Vegas is that he was at a very high trajectory, shooting at a location where people were very condensed in a very small location. There were other challenges that happened. I've been out to Las Vegas. I actually toured the grounds from the exterior with somebody who survived that day. And a lot of the gates were locked. They were chained shut. And so people couldn't get out unless they could, kind of get over them. But even still, he's 32 floors up shooting downward at that location. So he had an elevated trajectory. You're also talking about a hotel room where I don't even know how many hotel rooms are in that hotel, but it's more than one. And you also then have sound volleying off of all of these buildings. I mean, it's Las Vegas, for as loud as it is, it's also very small on the strip. And so there's a lot of consolidated space, sounds can volley all over the place. So there's a lot of challenges of identifying where the shooting was coming from, even within the building. In 11 minutes, he also, as the screen shows, he did have some of the firearms that had bump stocks, which allowed him to fire at a more rapid rate. He also had a number of firearms. There was 26 firearms found in that room. And they were all just kind of lined up, ready to go. They were, outfitted with the ammunition. And so it was a very quick turnaround.
That's one of the other reasons why, when I asked you, because some people said back then and even still think that he had to have had help. How do you get that much firepower up in a hotel room? It has to go by the front desk, go by the lobby, through the lobby and everything else. You just wonder how in the world somebody has that much firepower up there in that room without anybody noticing what was going on.
So there, for anybody who's interested in that and having those same questions, I would strongly recommend reading the law. Sorry. Hey, stop, you two. I'll start that sentence over. For anyone that's sort of grappling with those same questions, I would strongly encourage them to read the after action report that was published by the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. This is an individual who spent a considerable amount of time in these hotels, who was well known by the staff, high roller status, which means he doesn't just walk through the lobby like you or I would. He can go through special elevators. He's also not walking in carrying gun ammunition or gun cases that say Smith and Wesson or Ruger or, Bushmaster on them. He's coming in with stuff, not put together. He has it in duffel bags. So it's very nondescript to the average person. And, he also turned down housekeeping. So, one of the things that we saw in hotels across the nation after Las Vegas was you weren't allowed to turn down housekeeping because they wanted to make sure that people could go in and check rooms. Even to this day, there's some hotels that still don't allow you to decline housekeeping for that reason. So he basically took these rooms and didn't let people in them.
We mentioned Virginia Tech earlier too, the third most in terms of fatalities, 32 people killed by that shooter. That was one of the more interesting ones because that was dragged out for some time, wasn't it? Because he was going from building to building. The whole campus was on alert that there was an active shooter, and he didn't have the elevated perch you're talking about. He didn't have the high-powered rifles. I think he just had handguns, but he just kind of went methodically through that case. What jumps out at you from your study of Virginia Tech?
So Virginia Tech was a little bit different because there was two different events. He initially killed two people in one of the dormitories, and then he left the campus for a couple of hours, went and sent his manifesto to NBC News, then came back, went over to Norris Hall, chained the doors shut, and then opened fire. And he was active in there for about 10 to 11 minutes. the challenge with Virginia Tech was really the delayed notification of the first incident. By the time that they actually sorry, hey, out. Sorry. I'll start from the top of that sentence. By the time that the campus had actually notified the campus community of the first shooting, he was already chaining the doors shut. And by the time they notified the campus of an active shooter, he was 1 minute away from taking his own life. So, one of the things that really came out of Virginia Tech was the process for emergency notification systems. We've done some research on those. But immediate and imminent communication with as much information as you can give is critical when seconds matter.
Yeah, and that was just awful. Exactly what you said too. The first two shootings didn't alert anybody to essentially sound the alarm and to get into lockdown mode or whatever the case might be, whatever you want to call it. And that was back in 2007 too. So only 8 years after Columbine kind of put everything on the radar. Ryan, can you scroll down there? I wanted to take a look at a few of those other cases. And again, just to kind of ask you, Jackie, too, as you look at those, Sutherland Springs, you spoke of briefly, El Paso Walmart, San Ysidro, the McDonald's massacre, Robb Elementary School was Uvalde, we discussed as well, Lewiston, we discussed. I don't know if it's going to be on here because of the time, but you brought up elevated purchase, and I cannot help but think back to Charles Whitman at the Texas University of Texas from
Number
the
11.
watch from the clock tower. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's number 11. I couldn't see it. That was another one where, again, he killed people inside the building, and then, I think 3 people inside the building, and then from the perch, very, very hard to stop. That went on for like 90 minutes, I think, didn't it? How do you think that would play today? Given the heightened sensitivities and the heightened alert and so forth about dealing with mass shootings, if somebody gets that high level perch like that, would it be any different today? Obviously the hotel in Las Vegas gives us an answer to that question, but in a case like this where it wasn't as many people in one collective area as they were for that concert in Vegas, could the University of Texas thing happen today, and would it be any different?
So I actually went to school in Texas, and I've been to that site. And, the University of Texas is literally within the middle of downtown Austin. And so it's still a very highly populated area. And, just last year, we did see another shooting where somebody took a higher level trajectory and was shooting downwards. And that was in Highland Park at the 4th of July parade. He went to the top of a building and was shooting downwards. I can't, the reality is like anything can happen in one of these situations. We don't think of it happening in an elementary school. It happens in an elementary school, in places of worship. There's this really interesting article that was published back in 2011, and it talks about this idea of homicide adaptations. And it really stemmed when they were looking at this from, like, when we think about law enforcement with regards to their equipment. So, right, it used to be that police officers would get shot by people, so they got body armor. And so then the killers go out, or the perpetrators go out and get armor piercing bullets. And then you have to upgrade your weapons, and then they're upgrading their ammunition. And it's this really constant vicious cycle of just continual adaptation. And
Yep.
I think, that's what we see here. We also see a mimicking of behaviors. One of the things that we know from that pathway to violence is that these individuals study each other. And so they see the things that in their mind are successful to helping them achieve these higher body counts that they're looking for. And then they also study for the things that they might view to be less successful. And so they figure out ways to get around those things. With Virginia Tech, right, he chained doors shut. So that slowed down police response time. Other people might look to do that as well. There's a lot of different challenges. We see them mimicking each other's behavior. We saw here in Buffalo that shooter mimicked the Christchurch shooter with regards to live streaming his event. He's not the only shooter that's done that. There was the incident with the shooter in Virginia who killed a news reporter and her cameraman on air. But he, in addition to that, them being on air for their piece, he was also live streaming to Facebook. So, they're constantly learning and adapting from one another, but also adapting to their surroundings. So, I think it's important that we recognize that this is not a static threat, and something that as a society, whether it's as civilians, whether it's as law enforcement, right, we have to continue to adapt with it. Because, what's almost interesting to me is, we think back to 1999 with Columbine, and one of the things that came up in the Columbine Review Commission report is that one of the perpetrators was posting essentially leakage on his AOL profile, right? And we all remember, or maybe not all of us remember, how technologically advanced AOL was in the late 90s, right? You dialed up on your
I do.
telephone line, you heard the little hamster going, and you hoped that nobody was going to call and kick you offline, right? That is so archaic to where we are today that we've had to adapt our technological prowess just to be able to be in the same conversation, where really what we're doing on Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Twitter is exactly what we were doing on AOL, just in a far more advanced, sort of methodology. And
That's a
so
great point.
I think we just have to continue to adapt.
Yeah. By the way, I was on CompuServe before I got into AOL. If anybody remembers CompuServe, but that's such a great point, and it has changed so much. I hope as we wrap this up, Jackie, that the next book you write is going to be the amazing story of this massive sudden decline in mass shootings after this incredible rise that we have seen over the course of the last few decades. Is there any reason to think that that book is forthcoming? Is there anything that's going on now that leads you to think that this is going to wane rather than continue or even advance?
It's really hard to say. I think I don't ever want to diminish the severity of a mass shooting. I come from two communities that have had very high profile mass shootings. I grew up in the Parkland area and I went to college where Pulse happened. And, I think that one of the challenges, I think, to really addressing this problem is the fact, and I've heard this for the last 5 years in my lockdown drills work, is too often we watch this happen on TV, and I've heard it so many times. People say it can never happen here. And I myself have been guilty of that. If you had talked to me on February 13th of 2018 and asked if there was going to be a significantly high profile mass shooting where I grew up, the next day I would have laughed at you and told you no. And I would have been very, very wrong. And so I think we have to exist in a space where we don't live in fear, right? Because it is of all of the crimes that are known to law enforcement, this is like less than 0.1% of 0.1%. So it's very fractional to all of the crimes that occur in our country. It has a significant impact. It impacts a lot of people, and we should never downplay the severity of what it means. But we can't continue to exist in a space where we think that it can never happen here. How I always talk about it in presentations, just to say it can happen here, even if it's not likely to happen here. And so, a lot of
Well
the
said.
things that we look at to help prevent mass shootings, detecting that leakage, is really critical to not just preventing mass shootings, but helping to stop our suicide epidemic in this country. We have a lot of people who die by suicide, more so than they die by homicide. And so, if we broadly, apply those same principles to say, here's a person in crisis, they're calling out for help, let's get them the help that they need, we can prevent a lot of untimely deaths, not just those that make the news.
That's a great point. That's a great way to wrap that too. It's weird. It's just so shocking is why the mass shootings command so much of our attention, because there's a mass shooting every single weekend in the city of Chicago. Every weekend, between 15 and 50 people are shot, and between 5 and 8 or 9 or 10 are shot fatally. If they were all by one person, it would be called a mass shooting. Everybody would pay attention, but because it's not one individual, nobody pays attention. Mass shootings grab attention, and that's why they do it. I'm really glad you're doing the research on it, but I hope you're out of business someday where you don't have any more of these things to do. Or like I said, you can write that book about the incredible transformation we've undergone. But Jackie, thank you so much for the work you do, the research, and for presenting all of it to us. We really appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified for all our new videos. New episodes dropping every Tuesday morning, and we'll have some of our favorite interviews from the vault dropping on Fridays as well.